Good afternoon, classmates. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the significance of the Second Amendment in relation to the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution, which was supported by the Federalists in the 1780s, which eventually replaced the Articles of Confederation, was a much stronger document that held the 13 colonies together than the previous Articles of Confederation, which was a much looser connection between the individual colonies, making them the United States. The Constitution held the 13 colonies together by a still relatively weak federal government, but a stronger federal government, or at least a stronger set of laws relating to the federal government than the previous Articles of Confederation. One of the key disputes between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists was the Bill of Rights. And the Anti-Federalists, who supported states' rights in general, were strong supporters of having a Bill of Rights in the Constitution that would ensure certain rights. And the Second Amendment on the Bill of Rights was, of course, as we all know, generally remembered as the right to bear arms. Now, this is one of the most controversial amendments in the sense that it's one of the aspects of the Bill of Rights that we talk about today and that many Americans have strongly different views on. Of course, firearms are extremely popular in the United States being the most heavily armed country in the world. I myself am a gun owner in the state of New Jersey, and firearms, of course, are very popular, but one aspect relating to the colonial period versus the modern period is the application of firearms. In the 1780s, the United States military was basically non-existent. There was only a very small army, and for a time there was actually no navy, and the defense of the country was entirely dependent upon state militia for the most part. And militias generally were supported at the local level and were, as opposed to today's modern National Guard, which would be the closest thing to a militia. In the 1780s, militiamen generally brought their own weapons with them to form the militia, and that was the entire arsenal of the militia in some places. So having individual private citizens own firearms was essential to the national defense because they were the army, as opposed to today where we have a standing army, professional fighting force, augmented by National Guard and reserves, of which myself I'm also a member of the Coast Guard Reserve, which is a modern version of the militia to an extent, but we of course don't provide our own weapons today. We utilize those of the service. So things are obviously different. Another aspect of the Constitution, the Second Amendment in regards to firearms, was the fact that in the 1770s and 80s, of course, many Americans utilized firearms for hunting in order to feed themselves and their families, whereas today the majority of people who do hunt, which there are still many, of course, do it as more of a recreation rather than a means of survival. So the situation has changed. So, and even those who support guns, such as myself, should be take that into consideration. Robert E. Shalhoub wrote that the Second Amendment was, in some respects, was really written to prevent the federal government from making so that states could not have a militia. That was one argument. And this is a different concept than just saying that individual citizens should be allowed to bear arms. This is a statement saying that the federal government cannot say that individual states cannot bear arms in the form of their militia. But of course, at the time, the militias were generally armed by the individual soldiers who bared arms. So it's kind of a circular argument. Also, another interesting point was in 1967, the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice determined that the Second Amendment cannot be transformed into a personal right to bear arms enforced by the federal government, in the sense that the Second Amendment is not necessarily to be interpreted as a guarantee of the federal government to allow individual citizens to bear arms. This was of one interpretation in 1967. This also comes from Robert E. Shalhope's essay. Another interesting court case was the in District of Columbia versus Heller. This established the long-standing prohibitions such as bans on possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill are outside the scope of the Second Amendment. This basically stating that, you know, such common sense rules as the felons and those who have been deemed mentally ill are not allowed to have firearms. Their rights are, in fact, not protected by the Second Amendment. And this comes from Joseph Blocker and Darrell Miller's "What is Gun Control?", which is found in the University of Chicago Law Review. So essentially, to recap, that the Second Amendment is one of the most argued about and one of the most quoted and perhaps misquoted amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and one of the most important aspects of the Bill of Rights. Firearms are a very controversial issue in the United States, as they have been for many years, especially in the 20th century, when daily use of firearms became less needed and less practical for most Americans, and also at the same time firearms became much more deadly and became generally more foreign to the general public. While still being extremely popular in general, they are not as part of our daily lives as they previously had been. Thank you for watching our presentation, and I look forward to viewing everyone else's. Thank you. Bye.